Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. Just recording for you a video about the alternative policing response. I am using a set of PowerPoint slides which I'll embed close to the video on the online teaching site for you, and I will be using the same PowerPoint slides when we do our online chat in a couple of weeks' time probably. So today I just wanted to talk to you about this specific assessment and what's involved, talk through the structure, all of that sort of stuff. You can see that on the first slide, I always enjoy using gimmicky little images to demonstrate what the types of activities that you need to do in your assessment. The first, I suppose, gimmicky image that I've used here is a picture of some Star Wars folks doing some searches on Google, which is exactly what you will need to do. You won't need to dress up as Star Wars folks though. You'll just need to do some searches online for a particular policing response, just something that takes your fancy. There will literally be millions of these. You can get them from all over Australia and the world. It doesn't matter. Then you'll need to go to the library and you'll need to find some reading material. So this can be through the library databases in the form of journal articles, or you can find books or edited books and get a book chapter out of that edited book. And you need to read these things and find material that supports your points, okay? And that'll make more sense as I talk through the example. The different steps that we've got to do. And then once you have found your example and you've found your reading material to support, then you type up your response. Pretty easy. All right. So as you're probably aware already, the alternative policing response is due at the end of week 5, Friday, April 18th, August 2017. And it's due to be uploaded to the Milo site by midnight. I'm aware that a lot of you work during the day and that it's difficult to do that sort of stuff. So I've given you till midnight so that you've got time to do that. The word count is 1,500 words and the weighting for this assessment in your overall assessment is 30%. Now what you need to do is fairly straightforward. You need to use Google to search the internet to find a news article that outlines an example of a policing response. And you're thinking in terms here about a response that aligns with over-policing or under-policing. Typically, it can't be both. It's a little bit too complicated. Sometimes it can, but fairly rarely will it be both. So we will talk through what over-policing and under-policing is, obviously, in the first couple of weeks for you, so you'll understand what that means. Your example can be from Australia or anywhere else in the world, as I've suggested, and it can be old or new. It's up to you. Having said that, you're probably unlikely to find the older ones up online, unless it's something like Rodney King, which was fairly famous and has had a lot of commentary around it. There'll be no shortage of material for you. There's plenty of policing responses that leave a lot to be desired. What you need to do is then critically discuss this policing response in a short discussion paper and make a case for using a different policing response or style. So you need to say, outline what your policing response was. Then you need to say, this is an example of under-policing. Then you need to say, it would be much better if the police used this approach instead. Okay, you should be able to obviously consider the unit readings that you've done, the different unit ideas that you've read, and other literature. And I would argue that most of your research that comes in to support your response will probably come from other literature. You need to reference your response as you do with any other assignment using Harvard referencing style. So the different steps that you might work through for this assignment: use Google to search the internet to find a news article that outlines an example of policing where the police response aligns with either over-policing or under-policing, depending on what the example is. Provide a link to that article, or it could actually be a YouTube video that you find. Provide a link to that YouTube video. You might want to put a screenshot of the YouTube video playing or something like that in your assignment to jazz it up a bit. You can use images, all of that sort of thing is fine. You basically need to provide some evidence of what you've found, so I know what you've looked at, or you can take a screenshot of the article or the YouTube video and paste it into the Word document of your discussion paper. Number 3, you need to show the reader how your example aligns with over-policing or under-policing by doing reading about what that is, what those different things are, and incorporating that where you can. I'll give you an example in a moment. Then you need to be able to read about alternative policing styles. Now, we talk about a few of these in a couple of weeks for you. And then you decide on what your alternative policing response should look like. What would be better suited to that situation? So, for instance, your example might show, might be the shooting of a person, or something like that. And then you would say, well, obviously that's an example of over-policing. The police responded in an overly punitive manner. Then you need to go and find a different policing response, which might be community policing, or it might be using de-escalation techniques, something like that, to show that it's more socially just and ethically, and it has a more ethical outcome. Okay? Then you write up your alternative policing response as a mini essay, following the structure that I'll go through in just a tick. And of course, you upload your response as a Word document to the Milo Dropbox. So in terms of a structure, you've basically got about 150 words for your intro. It's very straightforward and small. I'll talk about that a bit more in a tick, about how to structure it. Then you outline your example. This is one paragraph, about 200 words maximum, okay? Just saying, this is what happened in the example. Try to keep quotes sparing if you are using a media article for this. Just read the media article and then summarise it in your own words, which is called paraphrasing. Then you need to write about what type of policing this example aligns with. Is it over-policing or under-policing? One paragraph, 200 words maximum again. Then you need to describe the alternative policing style or approach that you've chosen, that you think would be a much more ethical and socially just way of approaching that situation that you've talked about. One paragraph, 200 words maximum. Then you need to discuss in more detail how it would produce a more socially just or ethical policing response in this police instance. You need about 2 to 3 paragraphs for this. This is the major part of your analysis in this response. 600 words maximum. Think very carefully about the issues that you want to do. Don't make them really similar. So it would be more ethical and socially just because the person is not shot. It would be more socially just because the police would be using a less punitive approach. And then, it would be more socially just for whatever other reason the third reason might be. Or you might just have 2 paragraphs of 250 words or something like that. So that's the major part of your analysis. And I'll give you an example of how that might look in just a moment when we talk through the example paragraphs. And then, of course, you have a conclusion which summarises what you've done, and then you have your reference list. And it clearly says here that these are excluded from your word count. I'm actually happy to help you develop your approach. If you've found a policing instance or example that you want my advice on about whether or not it's going to fit, just email it to me and I can say, yes, this is great. If you're worried about what your 3 points are that talk about how it's, your alternative approach is more socially just, then send me your 3 dot points about that, align with your paragraphs that you're going to discuss, and I can tell you if you're on the right track. So that's really quite straightforward. You can also, check your alternative approach as well, and about whether or not it's going to be suitable. So some general advice about this assignment. Be imaginative and creative. Don't just tell me that the police need to not kill the person or that they need to be more heavy-handed because they weren't punitive enough with that person. Think outside the box. Really try and expand your mind when it comes to how can this situation be more ethical and more socially just overall. Think about how police need to align with codes of conduct. Make sure you read the marking rubric. It's already up online for you. When you click on your alternative policing response, you'll see a little one little section that'll take you to all the information about the policing, about that assignment, and then underneath it you'll see a rubric. Now that helps us to mark your assignment. Use it as a checklist of things that you need to do. Make sure you check this before you submit your assessment so that you can see that you've actually covered all the areas that you need to cover off on. It's really, really important. All right. Provide the link to the article. I've already talked about that. Take a screenshot. You might take a screenshot of the YouTube video if it's a YouTube video that you're focused on. Whatever you want to do, you can do that. But you need to provide some sort of evidence that this thing exists out there in the ether, that is online life. And then, of course, use subheadings. This is a good way to help structure your response and to actually make sure that you've got all the bits in there. Some questions that might help stimulate or, think about your example and so forth. What might be a better way of doing police than the example that you found? Policing than the example that you found. So what might be a better way of doing policing than the example that you've found? So if the person if the police officers used coercion in an interview, for instance, what might be a better way of interviewing that person? Using the peace model or something like that. Can ideas from international policing examples be applied? What are other different ways of doing policing that we've got around the world that might be applied in this circumstance so that the outcomes are more ethical or socially just for those people? How can the new policing response cause less harm? This is really, really important. Can the police use negotiation techniques? Can they use de-escalation techniques? Can the police use a different approach to that person in the first instance so that they don't go on the defensive and then, shoot the police officer? Whatever it might be. So try and think about how it can cause less harm overall. And of course, how can it be more socially just and ethical in terms of aligning with democratic policing principles? And this is something we talked about in the introduction to the unit overall. I've given you a whole bunch of different examples of police responses. You'll remember these from the first, one of the first videos that I did. I'm pretty sure it was in the introduction to the unit. And I'm also going to put these up online. I haven't quite done that yet, but I'm hoping to do that by the end of the week. There's a whole range of different ways that policing can happen, and these are just a few examples for you that you can click on the links of and learn more about. So what does the rubric say about this assignment? The first part of the rubric is talking about critical analysis. So you're critically analysing policing practices in terms of complex historical, social, cultural, ethical concerns for police, victims and offenders. All right, so we've got a whole range of different criteria here. Addressing the set task, pretty important, because if you don't do that, then you really can't get any marks for the assignment at all. Defining your key concepts. So if you're using community policing as an alternative way of doing this example, then community policing is something you need to define. Of course, you'll always need to be able to define over-policing or under-policing depending on which one of those your example aligns with. So defining concepts is important. Making sure that your content knowledge is on target. So if you're talking about how to make an interview more ethical, I wouldn't expect to see much discussion of so if you're focusing on an example of a police interview that went really wrong, I wouldn't expect to see a lot of discussion of American interviewing techniques in policing, because they use a lot of coercion, a lot of ways of manipulating people as opposed to building rapport and so forth. So I'd be looking for examples of discussion from peace interviewing techniques, which is much more ethical and is based around the notion that we need to build rapport with folks when we're doing interviews with them. So content knowledge needs to be on target, okay? Analysis of the policing style. So you can see here clear, detailed analysis of the style of policing adopted in the policing response. So that's in terms of whether or not it's over-policing or whether it's under-policing, okay? Critical analysis of alternative police response. It critically analyses socially just, ethical outcomes of an alternative police response using relevant literature. What else have we got here? Undertaking secondary research using information literature skills related to the subject matter. So, of course, using research literature that's current and relevant to support all of your key points is pretty important. The integration of the literature. So it's not just sitting there, you've actually read it, you know what it's about, and you're aligning your work with it by talking about it in a bit of detail. So a high level of integration and synthesis using reading material that's well integrated into the text. It's not just plonked at the end of every paragraph. And the number of references we're looking for is 10 or more, okay, to support your ideas if you want an HD. That's very important. And looking for evidence of reading beyond the unit materials as well. So the third area is communication of knowledge and research results related to the subject matter in the form of an essay. So clear introduction and conclusion, clarity of expression overall. So making sure that before you submit your assignment, print it out on a piece of paper, read it out loud to your cat or your dog, checking to see if there's any sentences in there that don't make sense. Clarity of expression is very important. Fluency of writing is very important as well. Appropriate format, so you can't write a compare and contrast discussion of these issues, because that's not what I've asked you to do. I've asked you to talk about a crap policing response and then talk about how you can make that response better. So you must have the appropriate format. And then, of course, Harvard referencing is very important. I wanted to talk briefly about how to structure an essay, because some people get tripped up on this, and I always like to remind people about how to do this, even though you folks probably in your second or third year now. First of all, you need your introduction. Your introduction is where you say what you're going to say. Okay, so it's really important that you start with a couple of topic sentences at the top, generally introducing the reader to what you're discussing. Then you actually need to provide a roadmap of what you're going to say. So first, this essay will overview an example of a police incident where blah, 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 blah. Second, it will talk about how this is an example of under-policing. Third, it will outline the three key ways, Third, it will outline an alternative response approach to this example. And fourth, it will discuss three key ways that this alternative is more socially just. Finally, it will conclude blah, 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 blah. I've basically just told you how to write your introduction there. So it's very simple, but you must have those components in your introduction. The body of your essay is easy. You're building your body of the essay around that structure that I gave you before, including paragraphs and sections on each. So you have the section that you have where you're talking about how your alternative approach is more socially just. You'll have at least three paragraphs in that section. Whereas other sections, like the overview of the example, it's just going to be one paragraph, and it's okay to use a subheading for just that one paragraph. So you need to have paragraphs that are really well structured. I'll chat about that more in a moment. And then, of course, you've got your conclusion, which is where you summarise your key points and you talk about so what for the future type of thing. Pretty straightforward stuff. I've given you some links there that you can go to have more of a read about those if you'd like to. What do good paragraphs look like then in this response? Now, I'm really good at collecting examples. Every year I run these assessments. I collect examples of good assignments for you, and I use them in these to show you what they look like. I don't ever give you the whole example. I just use little bits and pieces. So here's an example of a good paragraph in an example that I got last year of this alternative policing response. This was quite an interesting one because the person found an example where it was an interaction between the police and the KKK in America, and the police were, they were quite violent in their response to the KKK, and they actually, even though it was a group that they didn't, this student didn't ethically agree with, they also didn't agree with the policing response, and it was an outstanding one because they had a lot of discussion online and things like that. So what they did was they talked about how the policing response in this instance aligned with under-policing because they didn't actually help to stop the protesters from being violent. They didn't step in enough. They didn't work with the KKK in, organising their protest and all of that sort of stuff. But it was just such a brilliant response because it perfectly argued how this was an example of under-policing and clearly the ways in which it was an example of that and how we needed to move to an alternative approach. So this is the paragraph that talks about how the police were under-policing. Under-policing has been defined as the police neglect of minorities and their needs. Typically this refers to ethnic minorities, so forth. However, this example is somewhat more irregular. While the counter-protesters likely had people of ethnic minorities among their ranks, the KKK can also be seen as a minority, albeit in an ideological sense. So you don't have to really worry about going to this level of detail with your analysis, but it's an excellent example of a paragraph. So we've got the topic sentences up the top, some evidence in the middle, where they're talking about this. Regardless of which side the police agreed with, their duty was to protect all citizens. And so they're arguing that it's an example of under-policing because they didn't do that. In allowing the violence to affect members of both sides, the police were neglecting both sides, both minorities and their needs. Just one more sentence was needed at the end here that says something like, this demonstrates clearly that this is an example of under-policing. So you've got a couple of topic sentences at the top, then you've got your evidence in the middle, and then at the end you've got your linking sentence which goes back and says this is how it links to the overall topic, which of course is under policing in this particular paragraph. Now I use a process that I call peel. So peel is a way of structuring paragraphs that help you to make sure that you've got all of the bits in there. And you can clearly hear that I've been talking about this. So your topic sentences at the top is your first one, P, which is point. All right, so make your point. Then you've got another sort of, you might elaborate that point. So the point in this instance is under-policing has been defined as blah, blah, blah. You could probably have actually another sentence at the top that says, this example clearly aligns with the notion of under-policing. That would be your point. Then your elaboration would be under-policing has been defined as police neglect, blah, 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 blah. Typically, this definition refers to blah, blah, blah. So that's your elaboration. So point, elaboration, PE. Then your third E is your evidence, okay? And this is, however, this example is somewhat more irregular. The counter-protesters, blah, blah, blah. Then it talks about how they needed to protect all citizens. That's the evidence. So there's actually something missing in this paragraph, which is your fourth point, which is your L, your linking paragraph. So we've got our point, we've got our elaboration, we've got our evidence, or actually I'd argue that the point's probably not that clear. You've got the elaboration and the evidence, but we haven't got our linking point, which is our linking sentence at the bottom that says, clearly this indicates that this is an example of over-policing in this particular way, okay? So that's a good example of a paragraph and what it's supposed to look like. nice block together sentences, the writing is very clear, all of those types of things. And you can actually Google online this Peel paragraph structure and it will come up for you and you can read a little bit more about it. I've got an example of an introduction here for you. Again, you can see how this falls into that Peel structure of paragraphing. So at the top, we've got your point. Under-policing is a well-documented problem. Elaboration, however, sometimes it's more unusual and complicated instances, blah, blah, blah. Then the evidence is your roadmap in this particular instance. I will then propose an alternative. They say one such instance was this, etc., etc. And this example will be the focus of the essay. I will then propose an alternative response, etc., etc. And then in this instance, you probably don't so much need a linking sentence, which is your fourth one. But you can see this is a good example of an introduction. It's got an introduction to the topic, a bit of an elaboration, and then it's got your evidence, which is your roadmap in your introduction. This clearly says what you're going to say. Then you go to your body and then it says what you're going, that's where you say it, right, in your body. And then, of course, we've got the conclusion, which is where you say what you've said. You've got your point sentence, again, at the top there. Then we've got your evidence, which is, again, overviewing your major points. And then your linking sentence at the bottom, which is, so what for the future? How is this important? So on and so forth. I'd argue you could probably elaborate a bit more in your conclusion, but trying to keep it to that 150 words is pretty important. Anyway, that's it. At this point, if there were people in the room, which I'm hoping there will be when I do this online, that this is where I would be asking you some questions about this assignment. I hope that was helpful. I look forward to chatting with you all again really soon. See ya!